Sophos is one of the largest security vendors in the IT landscape, working with small business and enterprise all across the world. And just the other day, they released their Active Adversary Playbook, which is a 2021 or previous year recap of the security landscape and the threatscape, really, of what's going on with businesses and how they're getting attacked and protections and all that good stuff. So I wanted to take a short moment to recap what was found. We're already halfway through 2022, but this information is actually helpful for businesses as they are planning and trying to strategize how they need to protect not only their data and their employees, but also their client information. So it's relevant to see the evolving threat landscape and then think about what you and your business can do to put some protective measures in place and just take some even small steps to try to mitigate some of this. The important thing to think about is that there's not one way you're going to get attacked, and you're going to hear about that right now in some of these findings. So similarly, there's not one way to protect your organization. It is what I always refer to as the onion of security. It's many layers, and you have to add on layers just like they have to peel back layers when they try to attack you. So some of the important findings from this report, first of all, is dwell time. Now, what that means is once an attacker actually hits your organization, how long are they able to stay remotely accessing your network and your data before they do something? So dwell time was found to be an average of 15 days. So that means just over 2 weeks, the attackers are actually sitting inside your network, doing reconnaissance, looking at the data, figuring out what they want to steal, figuring out what they want to encrypt, figuring out how they can move across the network and move onto different devices and get into different accounts. Now, an interesting part of this is that it actually changes based on the organization type and the organization size. So if you had to guess right now, what organization size are they able to dwell longer in? Smaller organizations. There's lots of reasons that could be. I'm not going to pretend I know exactly what that might be, but I could theorize that it's because small organizations normally don't have a lot of security in place, or they don't feel their data is valuable, or sometimes they just don't think about what security means and how important it is. So smaller organizations have a longer dwell time. Interestingly enough, when you go into the larger size, it's education that has a longer dwell time. So it's not large enterprise corporations, it's education. So weirdly enough, small companies and the education environment have the longest dwell time. So that says something about the education system, maybe in North America, but yeah, there's a lot of dwell time there, meaning that those smaller organizations and education probably need better security, because if we keep talking about this, you'll find that 47% of the attackers got in through a known vulnerability. So that means that these organizations aren't patching or aren't securing from the threats that are already known. Think about that. 47% of attackers got through with a known vulnerability. That means they knew how to get in. They didn't even have to work at it. They just knew, hey, there's a new threat going around, there's a new vulnerability. Microsoft hasn't patched this. There's a Linux exploit in this. We can walk right in the door, use a common tool, punch right through, get in. And that was half of the successful attacks. So we'll talk about how to protect from that in a minute. Once inside, 82% of the actors used Remote Desktop Protocol, also known as RDP. This is how people remote into another computer when the Windows environment. So some people use a VPN and then they remote desktop into a work computer, remote desktop into a server, use terminal services. 82% of the attackers are doing this too within these organizations that have already been hit. So when we talk about lateral spread in the security landscape, that's how once you get in through a known vulnerability, you're able to kind of walk and get onto other systems. And this is how they get access to all the data and figure out your entire network and are able to lock everything down. They just jump from system to system, and then they put in a little foothold there so they can get back into it. That leads to the bigger dwell time. 73% of all those attacks ended up being about ransomware. So when you look at the motivation, the reason they're getting in here, why are they dwelling so long within that network? Well, the end game is ransomware. Encrypt stuff, steal stuff, lock it down, try to extort you, leak information. That is a big motivator. Interestingly enough, this actually dropped from the previous year by about, I want to say, 10 percentage points. So ransomware is still largely prevalent and it's hitting everywhere, but it's dropping just a little bit because there's other things they're doing with the data now too. There's a large use of initial access brokers, so IAB as they're referred to. With a long dwell time, the other reason some of these agents stick around and keep access to systems is that they're actually selling that access. So if one of these threat organizations, these ransomware organizations, or just a bad individual can get access to a bunch of these organizations with a known exploit, they can just start firing off scripts to get into all these systems and all these companies. They get inside, they sit for a little bit, they build a list of places they're able to get into, and then they can sell that on the dark web. And then let those other people go in there and deploy the ransomware. So it's quick, easy money for them. Lastly, once they got in, other than remote desktop, what did they do to attack? How did they do it? What tools did they use? In the past, there were a lot of pre-built programs that were being used to execute things. But what happened was the software security companies like Sophos ended up being able to build their antivirus, malware, EDR engines to detect some of that software. So what the threat actors are largely using now is PowerShell. This is something that's built into Microsoft Windows. It's a valid tool. So again, remote desktop is a valid tool. PowerShell is a valid tool. And they're using those means to move around, drop their attacks, and actually deploy them. Because they're valid tools, the security software thinks this is a normal user accessing this computer. They're getting in through remote desktop using a login. After that, they're using PowerShell to run administrator commands. It looks normal. So they're able to execute and then deploy these things and get past there. So that was the big recap of exactly what took place last year. And it gives you an idea of what's going to continue in 2022 and beyond. Now, the big question, the obvious thing you want to know is, how do you protect your business and organization? What does all this mean to you? What are the actionable items? So I have a couple recommendations. First and foremost, the easiest that every business should be doing is having proper patch policies that are deploying the software updates. If I'm telling you right now that 47% of all the attacks were successful because there was a known vulnerability, that's what the patches protect against. So when something drops that's really big, we're immediately patching all of our clients' systems. Anything that's a critical update or a critical security vulnerability, we got to patch that same day because we don't want those organizations to be part of that. So patch policies and rolling out security updates, absolutely critical. If you look at the CISA guidance and everything from the government, the first thing that they will always tell you is make sure you're executing patches. If you're trying to get cyber insurance these days, one of the first questions they ask on that application is, do you deploy critical patches in a timely manner? It is that important, and honestly, at this point, it's that simple. So make sure you have a patch policy. If you don't know what that is, hit me up. If you don't know if your IT company is doing it, hit them up. Just make sure it's in place. Next up, multiple security tools. So I talked about that onion at the beginning, the onion approach to security. There's not one solution that does it all. If there was, it would be radically easy for every attacker to just hit that one solution. You have to put in a layer. So think about it. Email security protects against certain stuff. The antivirus software you run on the computer protects against certain stuff. And then you start diving into some other solutions that use AI or machine learning to do some analytics. And then you have other further monitoring that can be pushed out through MDR or having a dedicated SOC team, SOC, Security Operations Center, that's going to be monitoring all the traffic and real-time information and start looking at behavioral analysis. So think of the example of Microsoft 365 saying, hey, we saw someone logging into your account from a foreign country. Well, it's not necessarily bad, but it is interesting information you need to pay attention to. So start thinking about what your organization's layered approach to security is. Even the very simple step that you can do right now of start talking to your team about security and what it means. That is a really important thing to be doing. So think about the layers and how you can roll those out. Lastly, lessen the amount of privilege that users have on a computer. People don't like to hear this. They think it's draconian, but there's actually a practical reason to it. Your team does not always need full access to everything at every time. And I'm saying this from the background administrator level. Your team doesn't need to be able to tear through and run PowerShell scripts. Remember how I talked about PowerShell earlier and how that's used as an attack tool? Nobody on your team probably, I should say most people on your team probably do not know what PowerShell is. So why do they need access to it to run full administrator commands on their workstation or on a server? They simply don't. So talk to your IT team about what it means to lessen that security. If they don't have access to it, or if they don't need remote desktop access, peel it back. Less is more in the IT landscape when it comes to securing your team. They don't need everything out the door. You got to tighten it down and make sure that you're restricting the amount of things that can be used to be exploited. So I hope that information was helpful to you. I hope it gave you something to think about, and I hope it has your mind kind of running through ideas of how you can help your organization and business in the coming months to try to strategize about what your security landscape looks like to protect you, your team, and your customers. If you need any help or guidance, hit me up. My company, 101 Digital, does a great job of securing businesses with these types of thought processes, planning, and implementation every day. Take care.